I didn't say anything. I just stood there holding a casserole dish with both hands, smiling at 14 people who had no idea who I was. My name is Meredith Calloway. I'm 31 years old. And for most of my life, my family treated me like a footnote in a story that was really about my brother. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I'm not someone who cries easily. I didn't grow up in a house where crying got you anywhere. What it got you was a look from my mother. This particular look, the one where her eyes went a little flat and her mouth pressed together, and then she'd say, "You're being dramatic, Meredith." So I learned pretty early to keep things inside, to process quietly, to smile when I wanted to scream. That's a skill that took me 30 years to unlearn, and it all started unraveling at my parents' Christmas dinner 2 years ago. My brother's name is Philip. He's 3 years older than me, and from the time he was about 7 years old, he was the one. Capital T, capital O. My parents never said it out loud. They were too smart for that, or maybe too careful, but it was there in everything. The way my mother's voice changed when she talked about him, the way my father leaned forward at the dinner table when Philip spoke, like whatever he was saying deserved the full weight of his attention. Philip went to Northwestern on a partial scholarship and took out loans for the rest. My parents co-signed. When I got into a smaller state school in Ohio, my mother said, "That's wonderful, honey," in a tone that made it sound like I'd told her I'd found a nice parking spot. No cosign offered. I worked through college. 2 jobs at the same time for 3 years. One job my senior year when I finally got a paid internship that counted for course credit. I graduated with a degree in accounting and a debt load I spent the next 6 years paying down, one paycheck at a time. Philip got his MBA. My parents threw him a party. I got a card in the mail that my mother had signed for both of them. The card had a Labrador on it. I don't own a dog and never have. I'm not saying this to make them sound like monsters. They weren't. They loved me, I think, in the way you love something you've stopped paying close attention to. Like a houseplant that keeps surviving despite minimal water. You're glad it's there. You just don't think about it much. For a while, I convinced myself I was fine with it. I moved to Columbus after graduation, got a job at a mid-sized accounting firm, and built something quiet and mine. A 1-bedroom apartment with a second-hand couch I loved, a cat named Biscuit who slept across my feet every night. A savings account that grew slowly but actually grew. A small circle of friends, real ones. The kind who show up with dinner when you're sick and don't need anything from you in return. I called home every few weeks. My mother would give me the Philip update. His new project at work, his girlfriend Suzanne, the condo he was looking at in Evanston. And then she'd say, "So how are things with you?" And I'd say, "Fine. Things are fine." And she'd say, "Good, good." And then she'd find a reason to get off the phone. I went home for holidays because that's what you do. I helped with the cooking because no one else was going to. I cleaned up afterward because it needed doing. I drove my grandmother to church on Christmas morning because she didn't drive anymore and no one else volunteered. Nobody noticed, or if they did, they didn't mention it. That was fine. I was used to it. What I was not prepared for was Christmas dinner 2022 with 14 people in the room. My parents had decided to host a big one that year. Extended family, my mother's sister and her husband, their 3 kids, 2 of whom were married with kids of their own. My father's college roommate and his wife, who I'd met maybe 3 times in my life. My grandmother, Philip and Suzanne, who had recently gotten engaged and were clearly the main event. I drove 4 hours from Columbus the day before. I brought the green bean casserole because it was the one dish my mother had specifically asked me to make, and I brought a bottle of wine and a hostess gift and wrapped presents for 8 different people. I got there at 6 in the evening. My mother opened the door, looked past me at the driveway, and said, "Did you come alone?" I said yes. She nodded like this confirmed something she'd already suspected and said, "Well, come in." the guest rooms made up. Philip and Suzanne arrived the next morning, 40 minutes before dinner, carrying a single bottle of champagne. My mother said, "There they are," the way people say it when someone walks on stage. I want to be precise about what happened at dinner because the details matter. We were all seated, 14 of us around a table that had been extended with a folding card table at the end, covered with a tablecloth so it looked intentional. My mother had done place cards. I found mine at the card table end, next to my father's college roommate, a man named Bill who spent the first 20 minutes of dinner telling me about his boat. When everyone was seated and food had been passed around, my mother stood up. She does this at holidays. She likes to give a little speech, a toast, something to mark the occasion. I'd sat through many of them. They were always nice enough. A little theatrical, but that was my mother. She started by thanking everyone for coming. She talked about the year, about family, about gratitude. She mentioned her grandchildren by name, both of them, with a warmth in her voice that I genuinely loved hearing. She talked about my father's health improving after his knee surgery. And then she said, "And of course, we're so proud of Philip. He's been made senior project manager this year at Donovan and Associates. Just remarkable, and we couldn't be more proud of everything he's accomplished. And his Suzanne? Well, we're just thrilled to be gaining such a wonderful daughter." The room applauded. Suzanne blushed. Philip put his arm around her. Then my mother looked down the table at me and said, "And Meredith is here too. She drove all the way from Columbus. She does bookkeeping or something like that." She said it lightly, like the thing she'd just remembered to mention before sitting down. A couple of people nodded politely. Bill turned back to me with a vague, pleasant expression, already moving on. I sat there with my hands in my lap under the table. I could feel the exact shape of my fork handle pressed against my palm. She does bookkeeping or something like that. I had just been promoted to senior tax manager at my firm, overseeing a team of 6, managing a portfolio of corporate clients whose combined revenue ran into the hundreds of millions. I had passed all 4 parts of the CPA exam on the first try. I had been awarded my firm's Internal Recognition Award twice. I had spent the last year mentoring 3 junior accountants, one of whom had just passed her own exam and sent me flowers to say thank you. But I was there too. She does bookkeeping or something like that. I smiled. I picked up my fork. I ate my green bean casserole, and I did not say a word. That night, I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, and I thought about something my grandmother had said to me once, years ago, when I was maybe 15. We were sitting on her porch in August, and I was upset about something. Some small injustice that I've long since forgotten. And she looked at me over her iced tea and said, "Meredith, some people are going to see you, and some people aren't. The ones who can't see you, that's not about you. That's about what they're looking at instead." I'd thought about that a lot over the years. I thought about it again that night. The thing was, I wasn't even angry, exactly. I was something more complicated than angry. I was tired. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 4-hour drive or the cooking or the cleanup. I was tired of performing okayness. I was tired of shrinking so that no one would notice how much space I actually took up. I was tired of being the footnote. I didn't sleep well. I got up early and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of 6 in the morning, and I thought about what I wanted to do. What I wanted, honestly, was nothing dramatic. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want tears or accusations or a speech. I'd watched enough of those play out in other families, real and fictional, to know that they almost never land the way you hope. You say your piece and the other person gets defensive, and suddenly the conversation is about their feelings and your anger, instead of the thing that actually happened. What I wanted was something different, something that required nothing from them at all. I called my firm's HR director that morning, a woman I'd worked with for years and genuinely liked. and I asked her to email me a copy of my official title, my latest performance review summary, and the letter from last spring when the firm had announced my promotion to the team. She sent them within the hour. No questions asked, just, "Of course, Meredith. Merry Christmas." The rest of that day was ordinary in the way that the day after a holiday always is. Leftovers, football on the television, my father asleep in the armchair by 2 in the afternoon, the cousins' kids running through the house, Suzanne and my mother sitting together at the kitchen table, looking at wedding venue websites on a laptop, their heads close together, my mother making little sounds of appreciation at sheet 1. I watched them from the doorway for a minute. My mother looked happier than I'd seen her look in years. I don't think she meant to hurt me. I genuinely don't. I think she just didn't see me clearly enough to know what she'd done. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. It's not that the people who make you invisible are cruel. A lot of them aren't. They're just looking somewhere else. And after long enough, you start to wonder whether the problem is that you're not bright enough to be seen, or whether the problem is something about the direction of their gaze. I went back to Columbus that afternoon. I hugged everyone goodbye. I hugged my mother last, and she held on for a moment and she said, "Drive safe, sweetie," and I said I would. I didn't say anything about dinner. I didn't mention the toast. I just got in my car and drove north for 4 hours with the radio on and the heater running and the Ohio landscape going gray and flat in the winter light. I spent January doing what I do best, quietly working. My firm's biggest client at the time was a regional logistics company called Hartwell Distribution. Family-owned, third generation, about $90 million in annual revenue. I'd been their lead account manager for 2 years, and their CFO, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s named Barbara, had become someone I genuinely respected. She was exacting and direct, and she didn't waste words, and she treated me like someone whose opinion was worth something, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. In January, Hartwell was in the middle of restructuring some of their long-term contracts and needed a full financial review done quickly. 3 weeks, tight timeline, complex enough that I put in some long nights. I got it done. Barbara called me personally when she received the final report and said, "Meredith, this is exceptional work. I want to bring you to the board meeting next quarter and have you present this directly." I said I'd be honored. She said, "I'm also going to recommend your firm renew at a higher service tier. You've earned it." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment with my hands flat on the keyboard and just breathed. Nobody at home would ever know that conversation happened, but I knew, and Barbara knew. And the 6 people on my team who worked those 3 weeks with me knew. That started to feel like enough. My mother called in February. She called to tell me that Philip and Suzanne had set a date, September, a venue in Lake Geneva, and that she was hoping I could come home for the engagement party in March. I said, "Of course." She said, "It'll be at the club, so bring something nice to wear." I said I'd manage. She said, "And maybe, Meredith, it might be nice if you brought someone." I let that sit for a second, and then I said, "I'll see what I can do, Mom." I didn't bring anyone. I went alone. I wore a dress I'd bought in November that I'd been looking for an occasion to wear, a deep burgundy wrap dress that I knew looked good on me, because 3 separate people had told me so when I'd tried it on at the store. And I am not the kind of person who dismisses that kind of data. The club was exactly what you'd expect. High ceilings, round tables with white linens, a bar along one wall, my parents' friends and my extended family on one side of the room, Suzanne's family on the other, everyone gradually mixing in the middle the way people do at these things. I got a drink. I found my grandmother and sat with her for a while, which was genuinely the best part of the evening. She patted my hand and told me I looked beautiful and asked about my cat, and I told her Biscuit had recently developed an opinion about which blanket he was willing to sleep on. And she laughed her big rolling laugh that I've loved my whole life. I was mid-conversation with her when I noticed someone across the room looking at me. I say looking because it wasn't quite staring, but it was deliberate. A woman around my age standing with Suzanne's group, tall, with short natural hair and very good posture. After a moment she walked over. She said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you Meredith Calloway?" I said I was. She said, "I thought so. I'm Kezia Osi. I work at Meridian Financial in Chicago. We've never met in person, but I think we've communicated by email. Your firm did a consulting review of one of our shared clients about a year and a half ago." I remembered the project. It was a smaller engagement, but Meridian had been a secondary stakeholder on one of our larger clients, and we'd exchanged several detailed emails about reporting methodology. I said, "Of course, yes. It's so nice to meet you in person." She said, "I actually used some of the frameworks from your analysis in a presentation to our partners last spring. I've been meaning to reach out. Your work on that was genuinely impressive." I said, "Thank you. I meant it." She said, "What are you doing at this party?" I said Philip was my brother. She said, "Oh, Suzanne's my cousin." And then she laughed a little and said, "Small world." We talked for about 20 minutes. She was sharp and funny, and we found about 7 things in common inside 4 minutes. And by the time we exchanged numbers, I knew I'd found someone I wanted to know better. I didn't think about what came next. I was just having a conversation. But my mother had noticed. I saw her watching from across the room, and I saw the moment something shifted in her expression. A small rearrangement, like she was recalibrating. She came over a few minutes after Kezia and I parted ways. She said, "Who was that you were talking to?" I told her. She said, "She seemed very impressive." I said, "She is." My mother looked at me for a moment in a way she didn't often look at me, actually looked like she was seeing something she hadn't quite registered before. She said, "How do you know her?" And I said very simply, "Through work." I didn't explain further. I didn't hand her the performance reviews or the promotion letter. I didn't give the speech I'd been rehearsing in my head since Christmas morning. I just smiled and excused myself to get another drink. The real moment came in April. And I need to tell it exactly right because it still plays back in my head sometimes, usually late at night. Not with triumph, but with something quieter and more complicated than that. My firm was invited to present at an industry event in Chicago, a regional financial professionals conference, mid-level, nothing flashy, but a decent room and a good audience. My managing partner asked me to give the keynote on a topic I'd been developing for over a year. Effective compliance frameworks for mid-market family businesses transitioning between generations. It was, genuinely, the topic I knew better than anything. I'd lived it with 4 different clients. I had the data, the case studies, the methodology. I spent 3 weeks on the presentation. I rehearsed until I could give it without notes. I showed up to the venue in Chicago at 8 in the morning in a gray blazer and good shoes. And I drank 2 cups of coffee, and I stood backstage listening to the hum of the room filling up. 240 registered attendees. My mother and father, as it happened, were also in Chicago that weekend. Philip lived in Evanston now, and they'd driven up to spend the weekend with him and Suzanne and look at furniture for the new condo. I knew this because my mother had texted me earlier in the week to tell me not to invite me, just to mention it. The way she mentioned things about Philip's life as ambient information. I had not told them about the conference. I hadn't decided not to. It just hadn't come up, and I hadn't gone out of my way to bring it up either. As I was standing backstage waiting to be introduced, I got a text from Philip. "Hey, are you in Chicago this weekend? Mom said you might be." I typed back, "Yeah, I'm actually speaking at a conference today. Downtown Marriott." He said, "No way. Can we come?" I stared at that for a moment. Then I said, "It's open registration. Starts at 9, 3 dots. Then, we'll try to make it." I put my phone away. I walked out onto the stage. I gave my talk. I don't want to oversell this. I'm not a natural performer. I submitted several months and get nervous like everyone gets 5 minutes, where I could feel my voice wanting to shake, and I made it stop by breathing and slowing down. But I know my material. I know it the way you know something you've earned through years of actual work, not through studying for a test or impressing someone in a meeting. And somewhere around the 12-minute mark, I stopped being nervous and saw interested. The way you get when you forget the audience and remember that you actually have something to say. When I finished, the applause was real, not standing, not overwhelming, but sustained and warm, and the kind that comes from people who've actually listened. 3 people came up to me afterward during the coffee break with specific questions about the framework I'd presented. One of them asked for my card, and, standing at the edge of that room, holding a cup of coffee and a business card someone had just handed me, I saw my parents. They must have arrived maybe 15 minutes in. They were standing near the back, my mother with her coat still over her arm. My father had his hands in his pockets. Philip was beside him, and Suzanne behind him. My mother's face was, I don't have a better word for this, rearranged. Like something she'd been holding a certain way for a long time had shifted without her permission. She made her way over to me through the thinning crowd. My father followed. She said, Meredith. I said, Hi, Mom. I didn't know if you'd make it. She said, Why didn't you tell us? I said, It didn't come up. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, You were wonderful up there. I said, Thank you. I meant that too. My father put his hand on my shoulder, a gesture so unlike him that I almost didn't know how to receive it, and he said, We're proud of you, kid. I nodded. I didn't cry, because I have spent 31 years not crying in front of my parents, and some habits take longer to break than others. But here's what I want to be clear about. I didn't feel vindicated. Not exactly. What I felt was something more like tired and more like clear. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and I'd finally put it down, not because someone had taken it from me, but because I'd decided to set it on the ground myself. My mother called me 2 weeks later, which was the longest phone conversation we'd had in years. She didn't apologize directly for Christmas dinner. She's not built that way, and I've stopped waiting for it. But she asked questions. Real questions, about my work, my clients, my team. She asked about the Hartwell project. She asked how I'd gotten into tax advisory specifically. I answered all of them. At one point she said, I think I've missed a lot, haven't I? It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It was something's in between, and I sat with it for a moment before I answered. I said, Yeah, Mom, you have. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I'd like to hear more, if you're willing. I said I was. That's not a fairy tale ending. My mother didn't transform overnight. Philip is still the one in a lot of ways, and probably always will be. Those grooves are deep. There are still conversations where I can feel myself being placed at the card table end, figuratively speaking. But something is different now. Something in the air between us. I think about the version of me that sat at that dinner table on Christmas night. Hands in her lap, fork in her hand, eating her casserole and saying nothing. I don't think she was weak. I think she was saving something. Holding it back until she knew what to do with it. I think about what my grandmother said about the people who can't see you. That's not about you. That's about what they're looking at instead. I don't need my parents to see me the way they see Philip. I don't need anyone to give a speech about me at Christmas dinner. I've stopped waiting for that. What I needed, what I've been building, quietly, for years, is the thing I have now. Work I'm proud of. People who know my name because I've earned it. A life that doesn't require anyone else's narration to make it real. My grandmother called me on my birthday in March. She asked how I was. I told her I was good, actually good, not performing okay good. She said, I know, I can hear it. I said, you always could. She laughed that big, rolling laugh. I sat on my couch with Biscuit across my feet and talked to her for an hour. And when I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a little while, and I thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. This, right here, is the thing that was always worth building.